The emergency alarm pierced through the underground parking garage at exactly 11:47 p.m., its shrill cry bouncing off concrete pillars and luxury vehicles that cost more than most people earned in 5 years. Marcus Webb didn't flinch at the sound. His body had been trained long ago to distinguish between genuine threats and false alarms, between the chaos that demanded action and the noise that simply required patience. He continued loading groceries into the back of his decade-old pickup truck with methodical precision, each canvas bag placed with the same careful attention he brought to every task in his carefully constructed civilian life. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The alarm cut off abruptly after 30 seconds, replaced by an eerie silence that felt wrong in ways Marcus couldn't immediately articulate. His hands stilled on a bag of organic apples, the kind his daughter Emma insisted tasted better than regular ones, though he suspected the preference had more to do with the illustrated labels than any actual flavor difference. Something had shifted in the atmosphere of the garage, a change so subtle that most people would never notice it. But Marcus had spent too many years in situations where noticing such shifts meant the difference between coming home and being shipped home in a flag-draped box. He closed the truck bed cover with deliberate calm, his eyes scanning the parking level without appearing to do so. 3 rows over, near the elevator bank that serviced the premium office floors above, a woman was running. Not jogging for exercise or hurrying because she was late. Running with the particular desperation of someone fleeing danger, her expensive heels abandoned somewhere behind her, stockinged feet slapping against cold concrete as she clutched a leather portfolio against her chest like it contained the secrets of the universe. 2 men emerged from the stairwell behind her, moving with the coordinated efficiency that spoke of professional training and shared purpose. They weren't running, exactly. They were hunting, pacing their pursuit with the confidence of predators who knew their prey had nowhere to go. The parking garage had only 2 exits, and both were monitored. The woman's panicked flight had already taken her away from the street-level door, deeper into the subterranean levels where security cameras had conveniently developed blind spots and help was measured in minutes rather than seconds. Marcus made his decision in the space between heartbeats, the calculation automatic after years of training that had never fully left his nervous system despite his best efforts to bury it beneath the routines of ordinary fatherhood. He stepped away from his truck, positioning himself in the woman's path but not blocking it, his posture open and non-threatening even as every muscle in his body prepared for violence if violence became necessary. The woman nearly collided with him, her momentum carrying her forward even as her brain registered the presence of another human being in what she had thought was an empty garage. She stumbled, and Marcus caught her elbow with exactly enough pressure to steady her without restraining her. Her eyes, wide with fear and exhaustion, met his for a fraction of a second, and in that brief connection Marcus saw something that made his protective instinct surge with unexpected intensity. This wasn't a criminal fleeing justice or a troubled person in the grip of paranoid delusion. This was someone who had discovered something they weren't supposed to know, someone who had made the mistake of believing that truth and evidence would protect them from powerful people who preferred convenient lies. The 2 men pursuing her had closed the distance, their casual pace never wavering even as they registered Marcus's presence. They wore dark suits that probably cost more than his truck, their haircuts precise and their movements economical. Private security, Marcus assessed instantly, probably former military or law enforcement, now employed by someone with enough money to hire competence and enough moral flexibility to deploy it against targets who couldn't fight back. The taller of the 2 men, his jaw square and his eyes flat with professional detachment, addressed Marcus with the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. "Step aside, friend. This doesn't concern you." The woman's hand tightened on Marcus's arm, her fingers digging in with desperate strength. She didn't speak, didn't beg or plead, but the pressure of her grip communicated everything necessary about her situation and her hope that this stranger in a parking garage might be the miraculous intervention she needed. Marcus had spent the past 7 years deliberately avoiding situations exactly like this one. After Emma's mother died in a car accident that still haunted his dreams with its senseless randomness, he had constructed a life of careful predictability. No unnecessary risks, no dramatic confrontations, No situations that might result in Emma losing her second parent before she reached high school. He worked as a construction supervisor on commercial projects, steady employment that paid the bills without requiring him to put himself in danger. He volunteered at Emma's school, coached her soccer team with enthusiastic incompetence, and maintained the kind of low profile that ensured his daughter would grow up with at least one parent present for every milestone and mundane moment of her childhood. But standing in that parking garage with a terrified woman clutching his arm and two predators closing in with the confidence of men who had never faced real consequences for their actions, Marcus felt the old training reassert itself. Not the violence, exactly, though that remained available if necessary. Rather, it was the clarity that came from understanding threat assessment, tactical positioning, and the psychological dynamics of confrontation. These men expected compliance because most people complied. They moved with authority because most people recognized authority and submitted to it reflexively. Marcus Webb had learned a long time ago that authority was often just confidence backed by the assumption of superiority, and that assumption could be disrupted by someone who refused to accept the premise of their own inferiority. Actually, Marcus said mildly, shifting his position so that his body created a physical barrier between the woman and her pursuers, "It does concern me. This lady seems pretty scared, and you gentlemen seem pretty determined. That combination usually means somebody's doing something they shouldn't be doing." The shorter man, his shoulders broad beneath his expensive suit, took a step forward with the particular aggressive posture of someone preparing to escalate. "Listen, buddy, you don't know what you're getting involved in. This woman stole proprietary company information. We're corporate security tasked with recovery and damage control. If you interfere, you're making yourself an accessory to corporate espionage." The accusation was delivered with practiced authority, the kind of bureaucratic threat that probably worked on most people who feared legal complications more than they feared immediate physical danger. But Marcus had heard similar threats before, usually delivered by people who wrapped their own criminal behavior in the language of legitimacy and official procedure. "That's interesting," Marcus replied, his voice maintaining the same mild tone that suggested he was discussing something no more consequential than weekend weather forecasts. "Because corporate security usually carries identification, works through proper legal channels, and definitely doesn't chase terrified women through parking garages at midnight. So either you're very bad at your jobs, or you're not actually what you claim to be." The observation landed with visible impact. Both men's postures shifted slightly, the confidence wavering as they recalculated their approach. They had expected either immediate compliance or confused hesitation, not calm analysis that exposed the flaws in their cover story. The woman finally found her voice, though it shook with exhaustion and fear. "They're going to kill me. I have evidence of what Meridian Technologies has been doing, and they're going to kill me to protect it." The accusation hung in the garage air, stark and desperate. Marcus felt her trembling against his side, the adrenaline and terror that had fueled her flight beginning to give way to the crushing realization of how alone and vulnerable she truly was. "Dramatic accusations from a disgruntled employee," the tall man said, but his tone had lost some of its authoritative certainty. "Ms. Chen has been exhibiting increasingly erratic behavior. We're here to ensure she gets the psychiatric help she clearly needs." The shift in tactics was telling. They had moved from corporate espionage to mental health concerns, searching for a narrative that would justify their actions and encourage Marcus to disengage from a situation that was none of his business. It was a sophisticated approach, appealing to the common desire to avoid involvement in other people's complicated personal problems. Marcus looked down at the woman, Ms. Chen apparently, taking in details his initial assessment had missed in the urgency of the moment. She was perhaps 40, her business attire expensive but rumpled, her face showing the particular exhaustion that comes from extended periods of high stress rather than simple lack of sleep. But her eyes, despite the fear and desperation, held a focused intelligence that didn't suggest mental instability. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. This was someone who had made a calculated decision and was now facing the consequences of that calculation with terrified determination. "Ma'am," Marcus addressed her directly, ignoring the two men for the moment, Do you want to go with these gentlemen? The question was simple, but it shifted the power dynamic fundamentally. By asking her directly, by treating her as a person with agency rather than an object to be managed, Marcus had reframed the entire encounter. The two security men recognized this immediately, their postures tensing as they prepared to prevent the situation from developing in ways they couldn't control. "No," she said, her voice gaining strength despite its tremor. "I want to go to the police. I want to give them the evidence I have about what Meridian has been doing. These men work for the people who are trying to cover up criminal activity." "Enough," the shorter man said sharply, his hand moving inside his jacket. "We've been patient, but this ends now. Step away from her, or we'll be forced to take action." The threat was explicit now, the veneer of legitimacy dropped in favor of direct intimidation. Marcus felt the familiar coldness settle into his chest, the emotional distance that allowed for clear thinking in violent situations. His mind was already calculating angles and distances, assessing capabilities and likely responses. These men were trained, but they were used to scenarios where their training and authority provided overwhelming advantage. They had probably never faced someone who matched their skills and exceeded their willingness to escalate. "Here's what's going to happen," Marcus said, his mild tone contrasting sharply with the steel beneath the words. "The lady and I are going to walk to my truck. We're going to drive to the nearest police station. You're going to let us do that, because the alternative is a lot of paperwork explaining why corporate security got into a physical altercation in a parking garage at midnight." The two men exchanged glances, a silent communication that suggested they were considering their options. Marcus could see the calculation happening behind their eyes. They had been tasked with recovering the woman and the evidence she carried, preferably without creating a scene that would draw official attention. But they had also been taught to adapt to changing circumstances, to assess when a situation had developed beyond the parameters of their original plan. The decision was made when the elevator dinged, the doors sliding open to reveal an elderly couple shuffling toward their car with the slow deliberation of people for whom a late dinner required recovery time. The presence of witnesses changed everything. Whatever these men had been prepared to do in an empty parking garage, they weren't willing to do it in front of civilians who might remember faces and testify about what they had seen. "This isn't over," the tall man said quietly, his eyes fixed on Marcus with the flat promise of someone marking a target for future attention. "You've made a very serious mistake interfering in corporate business." "Maybe," Marcus replied, already guiding Ms. Chen toward his truck. "But I've made worse mistakes and lived to regret them. I figure I can handle whatever consequences come from helping someone who needs help." The two security men watched as Marcus opened the passenger door of his truck and helped Ms. Chen inside, their stillness more threatening than movement would have been. They were memorizing details, Marcus knew, collecting information that would be used to identify him, to research his background, to find pressure points that could be exploited when they resumed their pursuit of their target. As Marcus pulled out of the parking garage and into the sodium vapor glow of the city streets, he felt the weight of what he had just done settling onto his shoulders. He had inserted himself into a situation that was clearly dangerous, had made himself a target for people with resources and motivation to eliminate problems. More importantly, he had violated his own cardinal rule about avoiding unnecessary risks, about maintaining the safe, predictable existence that Emma needed from her only remaining parent. Ms. Chen was crying silently in the passenger seat, her body shaking with the aftermath of adrenaline and terror. Marcus reached behind the seat and pulled out the emergency blanket he kept there, part of the disaster preparedness kit he had assembled with the same thoroughness he brought to all aspects of his carefully controlled life. "Here," he said gently, draping the blanket around her shoulders. "You're safe for now. We're going straight to the police." She clutched the blanket with one hand, the leather portfolio still pressed against her chest with the other. "Thank you," she managed between shaking breaths. "I didn't think anyone would help. I thought I was going to die in that garage. What exactly is in that portfolio that's worth killing over?" Marcus kept his voice casual, trying to help her focus on concrete details rather than the overwhelming fear that still gripped her. "Evidence," she said, her voice growing stronger as the immediate danger receded. "Financial records, internal communications, Engineering specifications. Meridian Technologies has been selling surveillance software to authoritarian governments, systems designed to track dissidents, monitor communications, identify protest organizers. The software itself isn't technically illegal, but the company has been deliberately stripping out safeguards, adding backdoors that let buyers access data far beyond what they're officially purchasing. Marcus processed this as he navigated the late-night streets toward the central police station. Corporate malfeasance on a massive scale, the kind of activity that generated enormous profits while causing harm to people far away enough that most consumers would never connect their smartphone purchases to political prisoners in cells halfway around the world. "And you worked for Meridian?" he asked. "Chief Financial Officer," she confirmed, her voice carrying a bitter edge. "I signed off on the deals without understanding what I was approving. The contracts were structured to obscure the real nature of the transactions, to make them look like ordinary software licensing agreements. It wasn't until I started seeing patterns in the revenue streams, inconsistencies that didn't make sense for legitimate business operations, that I began investigating." The professional curiosity that had led her to uncover the truth was evident in her voice, the analytical mind that couldn't let unexplained anomalies remain unexplained. Marcus recognized the type. People who were good at their jobs because they paid attention to details, who couldn't ignore evidence simply because it was inconvenient or dangerous to acknowledge. "When did you realize you were in actual danger?" Marcus asked, taking a corner and checking his mirrors for any signs of pursuit. "3 days ago," Ms. Chen said, her grip tightening on the portfolio. "I made copies of everything I had found and scheduled a meeting with our general counsel. I thought I was following proper protocol, reporting through internal channels before going to authorities." She laughed bitterly. "The general counsel called security instead of the ethics board. By the time I realized what was happening, they had locked down my office, frozen my access credentials, and declared me a security risk undergoing psychiatric evaluation." The speed and coordination of the response suggested this wasn't the first time Meridian Technologies had dealt with internal dissent. They had procedures in place, Marcus realized, systems designed to isolate and neutralize anyone who threatened to expose their activities. "How did you get away?" he asked, genuinely curious about how a corporate executive had managed to evade professional security teams. "I didn't go home," she said simply. "They expected me to return to my apartment, to follow my normal routine. Instead, I went to my ex-husband's place. We divorced 5 years ago, but we're still on decent terms. He let me hide there while I figured out what to do next." She looked down at the portfolio. "He's the one who told me to make multiple copies, to distribute the evidence to different locations. Said if they were willing to fabricate psychiatric problems, they might be willing to do worse." "Smart man," Marcus observed, making a mental note that Ms. Chen had at least one person in her life who understood threat assessment and basic security principles. They arrived at the police station just after midnight, the building brightly lit against the darkness like a beacon of official safety and procedural justice. Marcus helped Ms. Chen out of the truck, noticing how she moved with the stiffness of someone whose body had been running on adrenaline for days and was now beginning to acknowledge the accumulated exhaustion. Inside, the station hummed with the particular energy of night shift law enforcement, a combination of boredom and readiness that Marcus remembered from his own experience with military security details. A desk sergeant looked up at their entrance, his expression shifting from routine processing to heightened attention as he took in Ms. Chen's appearance and the intensity of her grip on the portfolio. "We need to speak with a detective," Marcus said clearly. "This woman has evidence of corporate criminal activity, and she's been pursued by people claiming to be corporate security but who may be engaged in witness intimidation." The sergeant's demeanor shifted immediately, the bureaucratic routine giving way to professional engagement. He made a quick phone call, then directed them to a conference room where they could wait for Detective Morris, who apparently handled corporate crime cases. The conference room was generic in the way that all institutional spaces are generic, with neutral paint, fluorescent lighting, and furniture designed for function rather than comfort. Ms. Chen collapsed into a chair with visible relief, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the exhaustion that had been held at bay by fear and necessity. Marcus remained standing, his back to the wall where he could watch both the door and the single window that looked out onto the parking lot. Old habits died hard, and the habits that had kept him alive through 3 deployments died harder than most. "I don't even know your name," Ms. Chen said suddenly, looking up at him with eyes that were beginning to register the magnitude of what had just happened. "You saved my life, and I don't even know who you are." "Marcus Webb," he said simply. "I'm a construction supervisor." Single dad. Was in the wrong place at the wrong time, or the right place at the right time, depending on how you look at it. "Catherine," she offered. "Catherine Chen." And it was definitely the right place at the right time. "If you hadn't been there, if you hadn't helped me," she trailed off, unwilling or unable to complete the thought. The door opened before Marcus could respond, admitting a woman in her late 40s wearing a detective's shield clipped to her belt and the expression of someone who had been woken from sleep but was too professional to show irritation about it. "Detective Sarah Morris," she introduced herself, shaking hands with both of them before settling into a chair across from Catherine. "I understand you have information about corporate criminal activity?" What followed was an intensive 2-hour interview during which Catherine outlined everything she had discovered, methodically presenting the evidence she had compiled with the same attention to detail that had probably made her an excellent CFO before she discovered her company's criminal activities. Detective Morris listened with increasing intensity, occasionally asking clarifying questions but mostly allowing Catherine to present her case without interruption. Marcus remained largely silent during the interview, his role shifting from protector to witness. He provided his own account of the parking garage encounter when asked, describing the 2 security men and their behavior with the precise detail of someone trained to observe and report tactical situations. As dawn began lightening the windows of the conference room, Detective Morris leaned back in her chair with the expression of someone who had just been handed a case that would define her career and consume her life for the foreseeable future. "Ms. Chen, what you've presented here is substantial. I'm going to need to bring in federal authorities, probably the FBI and the Department of Justice. This goes beyond local jurisdiction." Catherine nodded, exhaustion finally overwhelming the adrenaline that had sustained her. "What happens to me now?" The question carried the weight of someone who understood that her life, as she had known it, was effectively over. Even if she survived the immediate danger, even if her evidence led to prosecutions and reforms, she would be known forever as the whistleblower, the person who had destroyed her own career and professional reputation by choosing to expose wrongdoing rather than benefit from it. "For tonight," Detective Morris said, her voice gentling with compassion, "we're putting you in protective custody. Safe location, no one outside this investigation will know where you are. We'll need you available for interviews with federal agents, but your immediate safety is the priority." She turned to Marcus, her expression shifting to something more complicated. "Mr. Webb, you've done a remarkable thing tonight. You probably saved Ms. Chen's life. But I need you to understand that you've also put yourself at risk. These people, if they're as connected as Ms. Chen suggests, they will identify you. They will research your background. They will look for pressure points." The warning was unnecessary but appreciated. Marcus had already been running through scenarios, calculating risks, and considering contingencies. "I have a daughter," he said quietly. 7 years old. She's at her grandmother's house right now for the weekend. What do I need to do to keep her safe?" Detective Morris exchanged glances with Catherine, some silent communication passing between them. The detective pulled out her phone and made a quick call, speaking in the coded shorthand of law enforcement coordination. When she finished, she looked back at Marcus with a mixture of respect and concern. "I'm arranging protective surveillance for your daughter in your home. Not obvious presence, but we'll have eyes on both locations. In the meantime, I need you to maintain your normal routine as much as possible. Don't signal that anything has changed. These people will be watching for any indication that you're preparing for trouble." The instructions made sense from a tactical perspective, but Marcus felt the familiar conflict between operational necessity and paternal instinct. Every fiber of his being wanted to go immediately to his daughter, to gather her up and disappear into protective anonymity until the danger passed. But he also understood that panicked flight would only confirm to Meridian's people that he was a threat who needed to be eliminated rather than a random civilian who had stumbled into a situation and could be safely ignored. As the meeting concluded and arrangements were made for Catherine's protective custody, Marcus found himself alone with her for a brief moment in the hallway while Detective Morris coordinated with other officers. "Why did you help me?" Catherine asked, the question clearly something she had been holding back throughout the long interview. "You didn't know me. You didn't know what I had done or whether I was telling the truth. You put yourself at risk for a complete stranger." Marcus thought about Emma, about the world he wanted her to grow up in, about the kind of man he wanted her to remember if something happened to him. "I helped you because you needed help," he said simply. "And because the alternative was walking away and living with the knowledge that I could have done something but chose not to. I've seen enough of what happens when good people decide that other people's problems aren't their concern." Catherine's eyes filled with tears, the emotional control that had sustained her through the night finally cracking in the face of unexpected kindness. "Thank you," she whispered. "Whatever happens next, thank you for seeing me as a person worth helping." Detective Morris returned before Marcus could respond, her expression carrying the brisk efficiency of someone moving into operational mode. "Mr. Webb, you're free to go. We have your contact information, and we'll be in touch as the investigation develops. Remember, maintain normal routines, and don't discuss this with anyone outside of law enforcement." Marcus nodded, shaking hands with Catherine one final time before heading out into the early morning light. The city was beginning to wake up, early commuters and delivery trucks creating the first stirrings of another ordinary day. He drove home on autopilot, his mind already shifting to the practical considerations of his new reality. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway, Emma's grandmother's number flashing on the screen. For a moment, his heart seized with fear, the irrational certainty that Meridian had somehow already identified and targeted his daughter. But when he answered, it was just Emma's excited voice chattering about the pancakes Grandma had made and asking if she could stay an extra day to help plant bulbs in the garden. "Of course, sweetie," Marcus said, his voice carefully normal despite the turmoil beneath. "You help Grandma with the garden, and I'll pick you up tomorrow afternoon. We can stop for ice cream on the way home." The mundane conversation about pancakes and ice cream felt surreal after the intensity of the past few hours, but it also grounded him in what mattered most. Emma's world of gardens and treats and small adventures needed to be protected, not just from immediate physical danger, but from the knowledge that the adult world contained people who would hurt others for profit and power. Inside his house, Marcus went through his morning routine with mechanical precision, making coffee and scanning news websites while his mind processed everything that had happened. There was no mention yet of Catherine's disappearance or the evidence she had presented to police. Whatever investigation was beginning, it was still operating below the threshold of public awareness. He was on his second cup of coffee when his phone buzzed with an unknown number. Marcus considered ignoring it, but something made him answer, his voice neutral as he offered a simple greeting. "Mr. Webb," the voice on the other end was smooth and professional, carrying the particular authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "My name is Richard Sawyer. I'm the Director of Security Operations for Meridian Technologies. I believe you encountered some of my personnel last night." The directness of the approach was surprising but not entirely unexpected. These people had resources and connections that made identifying him a trivial exercise. They knew where he lived, where he worked, where his daughter went to school. The question wasn't whether they could find him, but what they intended to do with that information. "I encountered two men who were chasing a terrified woman through a parking garage," Marcus replied, his voice deliberately casual. "Whether they were your personnel or not, I couldn't say. They didn't seem interested in proper introductions." There was a pause, the sound of Sawyer recalculating his approach. "Mr. Webb, you've involved yourself in a situation that you don't fully understand. Ms. Chen is a disturbed individual who has made serious accusations against her employer based on misunderstandings and personal grievances. We're trying to help her get the psychiatric treatment she needs, but she's resistant to assistance." The concern in Sawyer's voice would have been convincing if Marcus hadn't spent the past several hours hearing Catherine's methodical presentation of evidence and watching Detective Morris's reaction to that evidence. This wasn't about psychiatric treatment. This was about containment and damage control. "That's interesting," Marcus said mildly. Because the police seemed pretty interested in what Ms. Chen had to say. Something about financial records and communications with foreign governments. Didn't sound like psychiatric delusions to me. Another pause, longer this time. When Sawyer spoke again, the professional courtesy had thinned noticeably. "Mr. Webb, I'm going to be very clear with you. You have a daughter. Emma, 7 years old, attends Riverside Elementary. You've built a nice quiet life for yourself and your family. It would be unfortunate if your misguided attempt to help a troubled woman resulted in complications for that quiet life." The threat was explicit now, the veneer of corporate professionalism dropped in favor of direct intimidation. Marcus felt the cold anger settling into his chest, the particular fury that came from threats directed at his child. But he kept his voice level, refusing to give Sawyer the satisfaction of knowing he had struck a nerve. "Mr. Sawyer," Marcus replied, his tone carrying steel beneath the calm surface, "I'm also going to be very clear with you. I helped someone who needed help. I gave a statement to the police about what I witnessed. What happens next is between your company and law enforcement. But if anything happens to my daughter, if anyone goes near her or attempts to threaten her in any way, you will discover that I have skills and experience that make your security personnel look like shopping mall guards." The statement hung in the air, a counter-threat delivered with quiet certainty. Marcus had no illusions about his ability to take on an entire corporation's security apparatus, but he also knew that most bullies, even sophisticated corporate bullies, reconsidered their tactics when faced with targets who demonstrated willingness and capability to fight back. Sawyer's response was cold. "You're making a serious mistake, Mr. Webb. Think carefully about what you're protecting and what you're risking." The line went dead, leaving Marcus alone with his coffee and the certainty that his life had just become significantly more complicated. He had approximately 24 hours before Emma came home, 24 hours to prepare himself and his environment for whatever came next. He spent the day methodically going through his house, checking locks, reviewing security measures, and making subtle preparations that would give him tactical advantages if his home became a battlefield. His military training, dormant but never forgotten, reasserted itself as he calculated angles of approach, identified choke points, and positioned himself for maximum defensive capability. But even as he made these practical preparations, Marcus found his mind returning to Catherine Chen and the choice she had made. She had discovered wrongdoing and had chosen to expose it despite knowing the personal cost. She had sacrificed her career, her safety, and her comfortable life because she couldn't live with the knowledge of what her company was doing to people she would never meet in countries she would never visit. It was the kind of moral courage that Marcus respected deeply, the willingness to do what was right even when right and safe were mutually exclusive. And by helping her, by refusing to look away when she stumbled into his path, he had aligned himself with that courage and accepted its consequences. As evening fell and Marcus prepared a solitary dinner in his quiet house, he thought about Emma and the world he wanted her to inherit. He thought about the values he tried to teach her through daily example rather than grand pronouncements. Kindness to those who needed it. Courage in the face of intimidation. The understanding that some things mattered more than personal safety or comfort. He had violated his own rule about avoiding unnecessary risks, had put himself and potentially his daughter in danger by inserting himself into Catherine's desperate flight. But he had also demonstrated, in the most direct way possible, that the values he taught Emma weren't just abstractions or convenient principles to be set aside when they became inconvenient. His phone buzzed again, this time with a text from an unknown number. A single photograph, taken from across the street, showing Emma playing in her grandmother's front yard that afternoon. No words, no explicit threat, just the image itself carrying the unmistakable message that Meridian knew where his daughter was and could reach her whenever they chose. Marcus stared at the photograph for a long moment, feeling the fear and fury warring in his chest. They had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed, had demonstrated their willingness to target a 7-year-old child to achieve their objectives. It was the kind of escalation that changed the nature of the conflict, that transformed a defensive posture into something more proactive and potentially more dangerous. He forwarded the photograph to Detective Morris along with a brief explanation, then sat in his quiet kitchen and began planning. Not just defensive preparations anymore, but a strategy for going on the offensive, for taking the fight to people who thought they could threaten children without consequences. The sun set over the quiet neighborhood where Marcus Webb had built his careful, predictable life. But as darkness fell, he felt the old training, the old instincts, the old capabilities awakening from their long dormancy. He had tried to leave that part of himself behind when he became a father, had thought he could build a life where violence and tactical thinking were unnecessary relics of his past. But the world had other plans, and Marcus Webb was discovering that some skills, once learned, never truly fade. They simply wait in the shadows, ready to emerge when ordinary fatherhood proves insufficient to protect what matters most. Tomorrow, Emma would come home, and Marcus would maintain the facade of normality for her sake. But beneath that facade, he would be preparing for a war he hadn't chosen but would fight with every resource at his disposal. Because some threats couldn't be negotiated away or defended against passively. Some threats required a response that went beyond calling the police or hoping that institutional justice would prevail. Meridian Technologies had made the mistake of threatening his daughter. They were about to discover that Marcus Webb's carefully constructed civilian life had been built on a foundation of skills and experiences that made him far more dangerous than they had calculated. The parking garage encounter had been reactive, a spontaneous decision to help someone in need. What came next would be deliberate, calculated, and executed with the same precision that had once made Marcus Webb one of the most effective special operations soldiers in his unit. The question wasn't whether he could protect Emma and support Catherine's fight against corporate corruption. The question was how much damage he was willing to inflict, how many lines he was willing to cross, and whether the man who emerged from this conflict would still be recognizable as the gentle father who made pancakes on Sunday mornings and read bedtime stories with silly voices. As Marcus sat in his darkening kitchen, staring at the photograph of his daughter playing innocently in her grandmother's yard, he felt the last remnants of his peaceful civilian identity falling away. What remained was harder, colder, and infinitely more dangerous than the construction supervisor who had loaded groceries into his truck just 12 hours earlier. Meridian Technologies had declared war by targeting his child. Marcus Webb was about to teach them why that had been a catastrophic miscalculation. The morning sun filtered through the blinds of Marcus Webb's bedroom at precisely 6:47 a.m., 17 minutes before his alarm was set to sound. He had been awake for hours, lying motionless in the darkness while his mind worked through scenarios and contingencies with the methodical precision of someone who had spent years planning operations where mistakes meant body bags and international incidents. Sleep had become a luxury he could no longer afford, not when every closed eye might mean missing the subtle signs of an approaching threat. Marcus rose from bed with movements that betrayed none of the exhaustion weighing on his mind. The discipline of maintaining routines, even when those routines felt like elaborate theater performed for an audience that might be watching, was something his military training had embedded so deeply that it operated almost automatically. He moved through his morning ritual with careful normalcy, brewing coffee in the kitchen while scanning the street through windows that now felt less like portals to a peaceful neighborhood and more like potential breach points that needed constant monitoring. The photograph of Emma playing in her grandmother's yard remained on his phone, a digital threat that he had forwarded to Detective Morris but couldn't bring himself to delete. It served as a reminder of what was at stake, of the line that Meridian Technologies had crossed when they decided that intimidating a child was an acceptable tactical move in their effort to contain Catherine Chen's whistleblowing. Marcus had spent enough time around truly dangerous people to understand that this wasn't just corporate hardball. This was something darker, a willingness to harm innocents that suggested the stakes involved were far higher than typical business disputes. His phone buzzed with a text from Detective Morris requesting a meeting at a coffee shop across town, somewhere public and neutral where they could talk without the risk of sophisticated surveillance equipment. Marcus confirmed the meeting time while simultaneously running through the tactical implications of the location choice. Public meant witnesses, which provided some protection but also meant constraints on what could be discussed openly. The detective was being careful, which suggested she understood the capabilities of the people they were dealing with. Before leaving for the meeting, Marcus went through his house one more time with the trained eye of someone who had conducted countless security sweeps in hostile territories. He checked window locks that he had already checked twice the night before, tested the new motion sensors he had installed in the early morning hours, and verified that the security cameras he had positioned at strategic points around his property were functioning properly and uploading footage to encrypted cloud storage that couldn't be easily accessed or deleted by external parties. The precautions felt simultaneously paranoid and inadequate. Paranoid because his quiet suburban neighborhood seemed so far removed from the world of corporate espionage and professional intimidation. Inadequate because Marcus knew that if Meridian Technologies decided to move against him seriously, consumer-grade security equipment and local police protection would provide only temporary obstacles rather than genuine barriers. The drive across town gave Marcus time to think about how radically his life had transformed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday morning he had been a construction supervisor whose biggest concern was managing a difficult client who wanted premium results on a budget timeline. Now he was driving to a clandestine meeting with a detective while checking his mirrors for surveillance teams. His daughter was under protective watch at her grandmother's house, and he had essentially declared war on a corporation with resources that dwarfed anything he could muster individually. The coffee shop Detective Morris had chosen was a franchise location in a busy commercial district, the kind of place where dozens of people passed through every hour and no single conversation would stand out among the ambient noise. Marcus arrived 15 minutes early, a habit from his military days when being first to any meeting meant having time to assess the terrain and identify both threats and escape routes. He ordered black coffee from a barista who looked barely old enough to drive and found a table near the back where he could watch both the entrance and the emergency exit while keeping his back to a solid wall. Detective Morris arrived exactly on time, her punctuality suggesting someone who valued precision and respected other people's schedules. She carried a tablet computer and a leather portfolio that probably contained case files, though she kept both closed as she settled into the chair across from Marcus. Her expression carried the particular weariness of someone who had spent the night coordinating complex operations while running on coffee and stubborn determination. "Thank you for coming," she said quietly, her eyes scanning the coffee shop with the same wariness Marcus had employed. "I wanted to update you on where things stand and discuss some developments that affect your situation directly." Marcus wrapped his hands around his coffee cup, appreciating the warmth against skin that felt perpetually cold despite the reasonable temperature of the morning. "The photograph they sent you last night was a significant escalation. We've increased surveillance around your mother-in-law's residence and coordinated with local police to ensure rapid response capability if anything suspicious is observed." The reassurance was professional and probably sincere, but Marcus understood the limitations of police protection better than most civilians. Response time, even rapid response time, was measured in minutes. The kind of professionals Meridian could afford to hire measured their operations in seconds. The gap between those two timelines was where people died, where children were taken, where the comfortable assumptions of civilian life met the brutal realities of coordinated violence. "What about Catherine?" Marcus asked, shifting the focus away from his own vulnerabilities toward the woman whose desperate flight had started this entire cascade. "Is she secure?" Detective Morris nodded slowly, though her expression suggested complications beneath the surface confirmation. "She's in federal protective custody now. The FBI took over her case late last night after reviewing the evidence she provided. What she documented goes far beyond corporate misconduct. We're talking about potential violations of international arms trafficking laws, conspiracy to circumvent export controls, and possible violations of sanctions against hostile foreign governments." The scale of what Catherine had uncovered was becoming clearer with each new revelation. This wasn't just a story about a tech company selling surveillance software to authoritarian regimes. It was about systematic criminal activity operating at the intersection of corporate power and international geopolitics, involving players who had every reason to ensure that evidence never reached prosecutors or public awareness. "Which means the people trying to silence her have even more motivation than we initially understood," Marcus observed, the implications settling into his mind like heavy stones. They're not just protecting corporate profits. They're trying to avoid prison sentences and international scandals. Exactly, Detective Morris confirmed. And that's why I needed to meet with you in person. The FBI wants to use you as an asset in their investigation. They believe Meridian will continue to apply pressure on you, trying to identify what you know and assess whether you're a threat that needs to be neutralized or a bystander who can be frightened into silence. Marcus considered this carefully, understanding immediately what the FBI was proposing. They wanted him to be bait, to maintain his normal routines while serving as a visible target that would draw out Meridian's response and potentially provide evidence of witness intimidation or worse. It was sound strategy from an investigative perspective, using available resources to maximum advantage in building a prosecutable case. It was also extremely dangerous, particularly for someone with a 7-year-old daughter whose safety depended on maintaining the illusion that she was an acceptable target for leverage rather than a line that couldn't be crossed without catastrophic consequences. What exactly would they want me to do? Marcus asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. Detective Morris opened her tablet and pulled up what appeared to be an operational briefing document. Maintain your normal schedule. Go to work, pick up Emma from your mother-in-law's house tomorrow as planned, continue your regular routines. But you'd be wired for audio and video, with undercover protection nearby if situations escalate. The goal is to document any contact from Meridian, to build a pattern of intimidation and harassment that supports the larger case against their leadership. Marcus studied the detective's face, reading the conflict there between professional duty and personal concern. You don't like this plan. Detective Morris closed the tablet with a decisive click. Off the record? No, I don't like it. You're a civilian with no training in undercover operations, and you have a young daughter who would become collateral damage if things go wrong. But the FBI is operating with a different calculus. They're looking at the big picture, the potential to bring down an entire criminal network versus the risk to individual civilians who happen to witness part of their operation. The honesty was refreshing even if the content was disturbing. Marcus had worked with enough federal agencies during his military service to understand their operational priorities. Individual safety was always balanced against mission objectives, and sometimes that balance tilted in ways that looked ruthless from ground level but made strategic sense from a command perspective. What's my alternative? Marcus asked, already knowing that declining FBI cooperation wouldn't make him any safer. If I refuse to participate, does that actually reduce the threat to Emma and me? The detective's expression confirmed what Marcus had suspected. Probably not. Meridian has already identified you as someone who interfered with their operation. Whether you cooperate with the FBI or not, they'll still need to assess what you know and whether you pose an ongoing threat to their interests. The difference is that cooperation gives you resources and backup that you wouldn't have otherwise. The logic was sound even if the situation was far from ideal. Marcus had two choices, neither particularly good. He could refuse to cooperate with the FBI and face Meridian's attention without institutional support, relying solely on his own capabilities and whatever protection local police could provide. Or he could accept the FBI's proposal, become an active participant in their investigation, and gain access to federal resources while simultaneously making himself a more visible and valuable target. Neither option eliminated the danger. Both came with significant risks. The question was which approach gave him the best chance of protecting Emma while also supporting Catherine's effort to expose genuine criminal activity that was causing real harm to real people thousands of miles away. I need guarantees about Emma's protection, Marcus said finally, his voice carrying the firmness of someone stating non-negotiable terms rather than opening positions for bargaining. Not just increased surveillance or rapid response protocols. I need people physically present, capable of immediate intervention if anyone approaches her. And I need to know exactly who those people are, what their training is, and what their rules of engagement allow. Detective Morris pulled out her phone and made a quick call, speaking in the coded shorthand of law enforcement coordination. When she finished, she looked back at Marcus with an expression that suggested she had anticipated his demands and prepared for them. Special Agent Chen, Catherine's FBI handler, wants to meet with you this afternoon. He can provide the specific guarantees you're asking for and answer questions about operational security. The mention of Catherine's handler reminded Marcus that he wasn't the only person navigating this dangerous situation. Catherine had made choices that had destroyed her career and put her life at risk, all because she couldn't live with the knowledge of what her company was doing. Her courage had created the opportunity for justice, but it had also painted a target on everyone who supported her whistleblowing. Marcus agreed to the afternoon meeting and left the coffee shop with more questions than answers. The drive back to his house took him through neighborhoods that looked exactly as they had 2 days earlier, ordinary people living ordinary lives with ordinary concerns about jobs and relationships and weekend plans. He envied them their ignorance, their ability to believe that institutions would protect them and that bad things happen to other people in other places. His phone rang as he pulled into his driveway, Emma's number flashing on the screen. For a heart-stopping moment, Marcus felt the cold fear that something had happened, that Meridian had moved against his daughter despite police surveillance and federal attention. But when he answered, it was just Emma's bright voice asking if she could help Grandma bake cookies and whether they could bring some home for their weekly movie night. "Of course, sweetie," Marcus managed, his voice steady despite the emotional turbulence beneath. "You make the best cookies with Grandma. I'll see you tomorrow afternoon when I come to pick you up." The mundane conversation about cookies and movie night felt like a lifeline to normalcy, a reminder of what he was fighting to preserve. Emma's world of baking projects and animated movies needed to remain intact, insulated from the knowledge that powerful people viewed her as leverage in a game she couldn't begin to understand. After ending the call, Marcus sat in his truck for several minutes, allowing himself a moment of weakness that he couldn't afford to show to anyone else. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him with crushing force. Every decision he made, every action he took or didn't take, carried potential consequences for his daughter's safety and future. The margin for error was effectively zero, and the stakes were measured in terms that made normal civilian anxieties about jobs and mortgages seem trivial by comparison. But the moment of weakness passed, replaced by the cold clarity that had served him well in combat situations where emotional paralysis meant death for himself and the people depending on him. Marcus had learned long ago that fear was useless unless it motivated productive action. Worry about Emma's safety was natural and appropriate, but it needed to be channeled into practical preparations rather than allowed to become paralyzing anxiety. He spent the hours before his meeting with Special Agent Chen making phone calls to people he hadn't spoken with in years. Former military colleagues who had transitioned into private security work, men who understood tactical situations and could be trusted to provide honest assessments rather than comfortable reassurances. Marcus explained his situation in broad terms without revealing classified details, asking for advice and perspective from people who had experience dealing with corporate security forces and private military contractors. The responses ranged from cautiously optimistic to bluntly pessimistic, but a consistent theme emerged from multiple conversations. If Meridian Technologies was working with professional operators, the kind of people who could conduct surveillance operations and intimidation campaigns without leaving obvious evidence, then Marcus needed to approach the situation with the same seriousness he would bring to a combat deployment. Half measures and hopeful thinking would get him killed or worse, would get Emma taken as leverage in a scenario that he couldn't protect her from through force alone. One former teammate, a man named Sullivan who now ran a private security consultancy in Virginia, offered advice that cut through the complexity with brutal simplicity. You're not equipped to go up against the corporate security apparatus by yourself. You need institutional support, which means working with the FBI even though that makes you a target. But you also need an exit strategy, a way to disappear with your daughter if things go completely sideways. Start preparing that now, not when you're already running. The suggestion was pragmatic even if it was distasteful. Marcus had built a life in this city, had established roots and connections that gave Emma stability and continuity after losing her mother. The idea of abandoning all of that, of becoming a fugitive running from threats that might never materialize, felt like surrender. But Sullivan was right that having options was better than having none, that planning for worst-case scenarios was how you avoided them or survived them when planning proved insufficient. Marcus spent an hour researching secure communications methods, encrypted data storage, and the logistics of rapid relocation. He established offshore accounts in jurisdictions with strong privacy protections, transferred copies of important documents to secure cloud storage with multiple authentication layers, and began assembling go bags with cash, identification documents, and basic supplies that would allow for quick departure if circumstances demanded it. The preparations felt paranoid even as he made them, the actions of someone who had crossed over into unhealthy obsession with unlikely threats. But Marcus knew from experience that the difference between paranoia and prudent preparation was usually only visible in retrospect, after disasters either materialized or didn't. The people who survived dangerous situations were usually the ones who had planned for outcomes that seemed improbable right up until the moment they became inevitable. The meeting with Special Agent Chen took place in a federal office building downtown, in a conference room that looked like every other government conference room Marcus had ever seen. The agent himself was in his mid-40s, with the particular weariness of someone who had spent decades investigating cases that revealed the worst of human nature. He shook Marcus's hand with a firm grip and directed him to a chair at the conference table before sitting down across from him with a thick file folder and the same tablet computer Detective Morris had carried that morning. "Mr. Webb, thank you for coming. I understand Detective Morris outlined our proposal this morning. I want to provide more specific details about what we're asking and what we can offer in terms of protection for you and your daughter." The agent spoke with the careful precision of someone accustomed to testifying in court, each word measured and deliberate. He explained that the FBI had been investigating Meridian Technologies for 8 months, building a case based on financial irregularities and suspicious export patterns. Catherine Chen's evidence had accelerated their timeline significantly, providing documentary proof of activities they had only been able to infer from external indicators. But evidence of financial crimes and export violations wasn't the same as evidence of witness intimidation and conspiracy to obstruct justice. That required documented attempts to threaten or harm people who cooperated with the investigation. Which was where Marcus's situation became valuable to their case. "We need to document Meridian's response to your interference in their attempt to recover Catherine Chen. The photograph they sent you last night was a good start, but it's circumstantial. We need recordings of direct threats, evidence of surveillance, proof that they're attempting to intimidate you into silence." Marcus listened carefully, understanding the investigative logic even as he recognized the personal risk involved. "You want me to wear a wire and let them approach me? To basically advertise that I'm available for intimidation while you record whatever they say and do?" Agent Chen nodded slowly, appreciating the directness. "That's essentially correct. We'd provide you with sophisticated recording equipment, virtually undetectable even if they search you. We'd maintain surveillance coverage, though not obvious protection that would discourage them from making contact. And we'd coordinate with local police to ensure rapid response if situations escalate beyond verbal intimidation." The plan was sound from an investigative perspective, but Marcus could see the obvious flaw. "What happens if they don't approach me verbally? What if their next move is more direct, something that doesn't involve conversation or negotiation?" Agent Chen's expression suggested he had been waiting for that question. "We assess that risk is relatively low in the short term. Meridian's leadership isn't stupid. They know that anything happening to you now, after you've already given statements to police and met with federal agents, would generate exactly the kind of scrutiny they're trying to avoid. They'll start with intimidation, trying to assess what you know and whether you pose a genuine threat." The assessment was probably accurate, but probably wasn't a guarantee. Marcus had seen enough military intelligence failures to know that assessments of enemy intentions were only as good as the information they were based on, and information was always incomplete when dealing with sophisticated adversaries. "What about Emma?" Marcus brought the conversation back to his primary concern. "Detective Morris mentioned increased surveillance, but I need specifics. Who's watching her, what's their training, and what are they authorized to do if someone approaches her?" Agent Chen opened his tablet and pulled up what appeared to be personnel files. "We have 2 teams assigned to your daughter's protection. Primary team consists of Special Agents Rodriguez and Kim, both with extensive experience in protective operations. Secondary team is local police tactical unit members who've been read into the situation and are positioned for rapid response. He turned the tablet so Marcus could see photographs and service records of the agents assigned to protect Emma. Both looked competent and experienced, with backgrounds that suggested they could handle themselves in violent situations. But Marcus's military experience had taught him that credentials on paper didn't always translate to effective performance under pressure. "I want to meet them," Marcus said firmly. "If they're going to be responsible for my daughter's safety, I need to look them in the eye and assess whether I trust them with that responsibility." The request was unusual enough that Agent Chen hesitated before responding. "That's not standard protocol, Mr. Webb. Protective details maintain distance from their subjects to avoid compromising operational security." Marcus leaned forward slightly, his voice carrying quiet intensity. "With respect, Agent Chen, my daughter isn't a subject. She's a 7-year-old who's already lost one parent and doesn't need to lose the other because federal protocols prioritized operational security over personal accountability. Either I meet the people protecting her, or I decline your proposal and handle this situation on my own terms." The ultimatum hung in the air between them, a moment of potential friction that would determine whether cooperation was possible on terms Marcus could accept. Agent Chen studied him for a long moment, clearly weighing standard protocols against the practical necessity of securing Marcus's cooperation. Finally, the agent nodded slowly. "I can arrange that. The meeting would need to happen at a secure location, and the agents would need to maintain their cover identities. But I understand your concern, and I think we can accommodate it within reasonable security parameters." The concession felt like a small victory, a confirmation that Marcus wasn't just a disposable asset in their investigation but a person whose concerns deserved to be addressed. They spent the next hour discussing operational details, reviewing the recording equipment Marcus would wear, and establishing protocols for different scenarios that might develop. Agent Chen explained that Meridian would likely approach Marcus through intermediaries initially, people who could maintain plausible deniability while delivering threats or offers. The corporate security director, Richard Sawyer, had already made direct contact, but future approaches would probably be more subtle. They might send someone to his workplace, engineer a chance encounter that looked coincidental, or use digital communications that were harder to trace back to official corporate channels. The goal for Marcus was to engage with these approaches naturally, to appear cooperative or at least not immediately hostile, while gathering evidence of what they wanted and how far they were willing to go. It was essentially an undercover operation without the training or support systems that actual undercover agents received, which made it both more dangerous and potentially more effective since Marcus's genuine reactions would be more convincing than practiced responses. As the meeting concluded, Agent Chen handed Marcus a business card with multiple contact numbers. "First number is my direct line, available 24 hours. Second number reaches our operations center if I'm unavailable. Third number is emergency response, instant connection to tactical teams. You memorize those numbers, and you don't hesitate to call if anything feels wrong." The emphasis on immediate communication suggested that Agent Chen understood the risks involved better than he had initially indicated. Marcus pocketed the card and shook the agent's hand again, this time with a better sense of the man behind the federal credentials. Chen might be using him as an investigative asset, but he also seemed genuinely concerned about protecting civilians who had been drawn into dangerous situations through no fault of their own. The drive home gave Marcus time to process everything that had been discussed and planned. He was committing himself to a course of action that would deliberately invite danger while relying on federal protection that might or might not be adequate if situations escalated. He was trusting his daughter's safety to agents he hadn't met yet, betting Emma's life on the competence of strangers and the accuracy of threat assessments that were based on incomplete information. Every rational calculation suggested this was an unacceptable risk, that the smart move was to take Emma and disappear into protective anonymity until the FBI completed their investigation. But Marcus also understood that disappearing wouldn't actually eliminate the threat. Meridian would continue to exist, would continue to pursue Catherine and anyone else who threatened their interests. Running would protect Emma in the short term while leaving her vulnerable to future threats from an organization that had demonstrated willingness to target children. The only way to truly protect his daughter was to help destroy Meridian's capability to threaten anyone, to support the investigation that could dismantle their criminal operations and hold their leadership accountable. That meant accepting risk in the present to eliminate threat in the future, trusting that his own capabilities combined with federal support would be sufficient to keep Emma safe through the dangerous period ahead. Marcus arrived home as evening settled over the neighborhood, the streetlights flickering on with their programmed precision. He went through his security check routine, verifying that nothing had been disturbed during his absence, before settling at his kitchen table with his laptop. He had agreed to the FBI's proposal, had committed himself to serving as bait in their investigation. Now he needed to prepare himself mentally and practically for whatever came next. He spent hours reviewing everything he could find about Meridian Technologies, their corporate structure, their security operations, and the backgrounds of key personnel. Richard Sawyer, the security director who had called him, had an interesting history. 20 years in military intelligence followed by a decade in private security consulting before joining Meridian. The man understood psychological operations and intimidation tactics, which made him a formidable adversary but also meant his approaches would follow predictable patterns that Marcus could anticipate and prepare for. The company's leadership team read like a case study in corporate ambition combined with ethical flexibility. The CEO had built Meridian from a small software startup into a multinational corporation through aggressive expansion and strategic acquisitions. The board included former government officials, technology industry veterans, and financial experts who specialized in emerging markets. These were sophisticated people who understood risk management and legal exposure, which meant their criminal activities were likely hidden behind layers of corporate structure and plausible deniability. Which made Catherine Chen's evidence so valuable and so dangerous. She had worked at the highest levels of the company, had access to internal communications and financial records that revealed the true nature of transactions that looked legitimate on the surface. Her documentation could pierce the corporate veil and expose the personal culpability of individuals who thought they were insulated from prosecution by their positions and resources. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen providing an address for tomorrow's meeting with the protective detail assigned to Emma. The location was a private security training facility on the outskirts of the city, the kind of place where law enforcement and military units practiced tactical scenarios away from public observation. The choice of venue suggested Chen was taking Marcus's request seriously, providing a setting where they could have frank conversations about capabilities and protocols without worrying about surveillance or civilian witnesses. The remainder of the evening passed in a blur of preparation and planning. Marcus assembled the clothing he would wear to tomorrow's meetings, selecting items that would accommodate the recording equipment he'd be fitted with while looking natural enough not to raise suspicions. He reviewed his work schedule for the coming week, identifying situations where Meridian might attempt contact and thinking through how he would respond to different approaches. But beneath all the tactical preparation, Marcus found his thoughts returning repeatedly to the fundamental question that had been haunting him since the parking garage encounter. Why had he helped Catherine Chen? He had spent years deliberately avoiding situations that might put Emma at risk, had constructed a life of careful predictability designed to ensure his daughter would never face the kind of loss that had already devastated her childhood. And then he had thrown away all that careful caution in a single impulsive decision to intervene in a stranger's desperate flight. The answer, when he finally acknowledged it honestly, was both simple and complicated. He had helped Catherine because in that moment, looking into her terrified eyes in a parking garage at midnight, he had seen his own past reflected back at him. He had seen someone who had made the right choice for the wrong reasons or perhaps the wrong choice for the right reasons, and was now facing consequences that seemed overwhelmingly unjust. He had helped her because he wanted to live in a world where people helped each other, where moral courage was rewarded rather than punished, where doing the right thing didn't automatically mean sacrificing everything safe and comfortable in your life. He had helped her because he wanted Emma to grow up believing that her father was someone who stood up when standing up mattered, not someone who calculated odds and walked away when the numbers didn't favor intervention. And he had helped her, Marcus admitted to himself in the quiet darkness of his kitchen, because part of him had been waiting for years for something meaningful to do with the skills and experiences that had defined his early adulthood. Being a construction supervisor was honest work that paid the bills and gave him flexibility to be present for Emma's childhood. But it didn't engage the parts of himself that had been forged in combat and honed through years of high-stakes operations where his decisions affected outcomes measured in lives rather than dollars. Catherine Chin had given him, inadvertently and probably unwillingly, a mission that mattered. A purpose beyond paying mortgages and planning birthday parties. A chance to use everything he had learned about tactics and courage and moral clarity in service of something that would make the world marginally better rather than simply sustaining his small corner of it at minimal cost. The realization was simultaneously liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it explained his own actions in terms that made sense beyond impulse or instinct. Terrifying because it suggested he had been unconsciously looking for exactly this kind of dangerous engagement, that some part of him had been dissatisfied with the safe predictability of civilian fatherhood and had been waiting for an excuse to return to the world of calculated risks and meaningful consequences. Marcus finally went to bed after midnight, lying in the darkness while his mind continued processing scenarios and contingencies. Tomorrow he would meet the agents protecting Emma, would be fitted with recording equipment, and would begin the dangerous performance of appearing to be an ordinary civilian while serving as bait for a corporate security apparatus that had already demonstrated willingness to threaten children. Tomorrow his carefully constructed life of peaceful normalcy would be definitively abandoned in favor of something more dangerous and potentially more meaningful. He had made his choices and accepted their implications. Now he needed to execute his part of the operation with the same disciplined competence that had kept him alive through 3 combat deployments and brought him home to build a life with someone he loved. Sleep, when it finally came, was shallow and interrupted by dreams of Emma playing in gardens while shadows gathered at the edges of his vision. Dreams where he ran toward her through spaces that stretched impossibly with each step, where his voice failed to carry warnings that she needed to hear. Dreams that left him gasping awake in the pre-dawn darkness, his heart racing and his body drenched in cold sweat. But when morning came, Marcus rose from bed with practiced discipline, pushed the nightmares aside, and began preparing for another day in the life he had chosen. The sun would rise over a world that looked deceptively normal, and Marcus Webb would move through that world wearing a wire and carrying secrets, waiting for dangerous people to make their next move while trusting that he and the agents protecting his daughter would be ready for whatever came next. The game had begun, and Marcus had accepted his role as both player and prize. What remained to be seen was whether his capabilities and the FBI's resources would prove sufficient to protect what mattered most while dismantling the criminal enterprise that had painted targets on everyone who threatened their profitable corruption. The training facility where Marcus met Special Agents Rodriguez and Kim was located in an industrial area 30 minutes outside the city, surrounded by chain-link fencing and security cameras that tracked his truck from the moment he turned off the main highway. Agent Chin met him at the gate, checking his identification before waving him through to a parking area adjacent to a low concrete building that looked more like a warehouse than a federal facility. Inside, the building revealed itself as something between a police training academy and a military combat simulation center. Shooting ranges occupied one wing, while tactical mock-up rooms filled with furniture and doorways allowed for close-quarters combat training. The smell of gun oil and cleaning solvent hung in the air, familiar and oddly comforting to someone who had spent years in similar environments. Rodriguez and Kim were waiting in a conference room that overlooked one of the simulation areas. Both rose as Marcus entered, their body language professional but not hostile. Rodriguez was a woman in her late 30s, her dark hair pulled back severely and her eyes carrying the particular alertness of someone who had learned to see threats before they fully materialized. Kim was a Korean-American man a few years younger, with the compact build of someone who maintained combat readiness through constant training rather than casual fitness. Mr. Webb, Rodriguez said, extending her hand for a firm handshake. Agent Chin told us you wanted to meet the people protecting your daughter. I respect that. If someone was guarding my kid, I'd want to look them in the eye too. The directness was appreciated, cutting through bureaucratic formality to acknowledge the fundamental nature of what they were discussing. Marcus shook hands with both agents before settling into a chair across from them at the conference table. Tell me about your background, Marcus said simply. Not your credentials or your service records. Tell me what you've done that prepares you to protect a 7-year-old from people who've already demonstrated they're willing to use her as leverage. Rodriguez glanced at Kim before responding, some silent communication passing between them. I spent 8 years in the Secret Service protective detail before transferring to the FBI. Protected presidential families, foreign dignitaries, people whose security was worth killing for. I've dealt with kidnapping threats, assassination attempts, and stalkers who thought they could get to protected persons through their children. Kim picked up where she left off. I did 6 years as an Army Ranger before joining the FBI. 2 tours in Afghanistan, mostly high-value target protection. I've kept people alive in environments where everyone was a potential threat and every situation could turn violent without warning. His expression hardened slightly. I've also failed to protect someone once. Lost a principal in Kabul when my threat assessment didn't account for a suicide bomber who looked like a child. I don't forget that failure, and I don't repeat mistakes. The honesty was striking, particularly Kim's willingness to acknowledge a failure that most people would hide or rationalize. Marcus respected vulnerability that came from genuine self-awareness rather than calculated impression management. What's your assessment of the threat to my daughter? Marcus asked, watching their faces carefully for signs of evasion or comfortable reassurance. Rodriguez answered without hesitation. Real but currently manageable. Meridian's security apparatus is sophisticated, but they're constrained by the need to maintain plausibility. Taking a child would generate law enforcement response far beyond what they're prepared to handle, and it would confirm that they're engaged in criminal activity rather than legitimate corporate security operations. Kim added his own assessment. The greater risk is psychological intimidation. They might engineer situations where Emma feels watched or unsafe, creating anxiety that pressures you to disengage from the investigation. They might approach her grandmother, or create scenarios at school that feel threatening without crossing legal lines. That's where our protection becomes crucial, preventing those psychological operations while documenting their attempts. The analysis matched Marcus's own understanding of the threat landscape, which gave him confidence that these agents understood what they were dealing with. But understanding wasn't the same as capability, and Marcus needed to know how they would respond if understanding proved insufficient. Walk me through your operational protocol, Marcus requested. Emma is at her grandmother's house. Someone approaches with what looks like legitimate business, maybe claiming to be from a utility company or delivering a package. How do you respond? Rodriguez pulled out a tablet and opened what appeared to be detailed operational plans. We maintain 2-person observation from a vehicle position to cover both front and rear approaches to the residence. Any unscheduled approach triggers immediate alert to our operations center and to you. We verbally challenge anyone who attempts contact with Emma or her grandmother, identifying ourselves as federal agents and documenting the encounter. Kim continued the explanation. If the approach escalates to attempted abduction or violence, we move to direct intervention immediately. Rules of engagement authorize use of force up to and including lethal force to prevent harm to the protected person. We don't wait for permission or confirmation. We act. The clarity was exactly what Marcus needed to hear, not vague assurances about doing their best, but specific protocols backed by clear authorization. These were people who understood that protecting children required accepting personal risk and potential legal complications if situations developed quickly. What about Emma's emotional state? Marcus asked, shifting to a concern that was equally important but less obviously tactical. She's 7 years old. She lost her mother 3 years ago. She doesn't need additional trauma from feeling like she's under constant surveillance or in perpetual danger. Rodriguez's expression softened slightly, revealing humanity beneath the professional competence. We've worked with child psychologists to develop approaches that maintain security without creating anxiety. Emma won't see us. She won't know we're there. Her grandmother has been briefed on maintaining normal routines while being alert to unusual situations. From Emma's perspective, nothing has changed except that you're being extra careful about checking in regularly. The thoughtfulness of the approach suggested these agents understood that protecting children meant more than just preventing physical harm. It meant preserving their sense of safety and normalcy, ensuring that the protective measures didn't become more traumatic than the threats they were designed to prevent. Marcus spent another hour with Rodriguez and Kim, asking detailed questions about communications protocols, backup procedures, and contingency plans for various scenarios. He pushed them hard, challenging their assumptions and testing their knowledge, looking for gaps or weaknesses that might become critical under pressure. The recording equipment Agent Chen fitted Marcus with was remarkably sophisticated for something barely larger than a shirt button. The device attached magnetically to the inside of his work jacket, its microphone sensitive enough to capture conversations in noisy environments while filtering out background interference. A secondary camera disguised as a pen clip in his shirt pocket provided visual documentation, though Chen emphasized that audio evidence would likely prove more valuable in court. Marcus returned to his construction site 3 days after the parking garage incident, arriving at dawn when the crew typically gathered for morning briefings. The development project was a mixed-use complex downtown, 30 stories of residential units above ground-floor retail space. He had been supervising the interior finishing work, coordinating subcontractors, and ensuring quality standards were maintained despite the developer's constant pressure to accelerate the timeline. His foreman, a grizzled veteran named Torres who had worked construction for 40 years, noticed immediately that something had changed. "You look like hell, Webb. Sleeping okay?" Marcus managed a tired smile while checking the day's work assignments on his tablet. "Just dealing with some personal stuff. Nothing that affects the job." Torres studied him for a moment longer before nodding slowly. "Well, if that personal stuff needs handling, you let me know. Crew's got your back." The simple offer of support reminded Marcus why he had always preferred working with construction crews over corporate environments. These were people who understood loyalty based on shared work rather than strategic advantage, who measured relationships in terms of reliability under pressure rather than usefulness for advancing careers. The morning proceeded normally until mid-afternoon when a man in an expensive suit appeared at the construction site entrance, speaking briefly with the security guard before being directed toward the trailer that served as Marcus's temporary office. Through the trailer window, Marcus watched the man approach with the confident stride of someone accustomed to being admitted anywhere without question. Marcus activated the recording equipment with a subtle gesture Agent Chen had taught him, then opened the trailer door before the visitor could knock. "Can I help you?" The man smiled with professional warmth that didn't reach his eyes. "Mr. Webb? My name is David Chen. I'm an attorney with Morrison & Associates. I'd like to speak with you about a matter involving Meridian Technologies." Marcus stepped aside to let the attorney enter the cramped trailer, noting how Chen's gaze quickly cataloged everything in the space before settling on Marcus with assessing intensity. "Please, have a seat." Chen settled into the single visitor's chair, crossing his legs with casual confidence. "I'll be direct, Mr. Webb. My firm represents Meridian Technologies in various legal matters. We understand you had an encounter with some of their security personnel several nights ago, and we'd like to resolve any misunderstandings before they escalate into unnecessary complications." The phrasing was carefully neutral, acknowledging the parking garage incident without admitting anything that could be used against Meridian later. Marcus leaned against his desk, arms crossed, his body language deliberately casual. "I'm not sure what misunderstandings you're referring to. I helped someone who was being chased through a parking garage. Seemed like the right thing to do at the time." Chen's smile tightened fractionally. "Of course. Very commendable. However, the woman you assisted has made certain allegations against my client that are entirely without merit. She's a troubled individual who was terminated from her position due to performance issues and behavioral concerns. The security personnel were attempting to ensure she received appropriate medical evaluation." Marcus let the silence stretch for a moment, watching Chen's confidence waver slightly under sustained eye contact. "That's interesting, because she seemed pretty coherent when she explained that your client has been selling surveillance software to foreign governments in violation of export controls and international law." The attorney's expression froze, his professional mask cracking momentarily before reasserting itself. "Mr. Webb, I'm not at liberty to discuss confidential business matters. What I can tell you is that Meridian Technologies conducts all operations in full compliance with applicable laws and regulations." Any suggestions otherwise are defamatory and potentially actionable. The shift from negotiation to threat was subtle but unmistakable. Marcus understood the message being delivered beneath the legal language. Stop talking about Catherine Chen's allegations or face consequences. Mr. Chen, Marcus said mildly, I've given statements to police about what I witnessed. I've told the truth as I understand it. If your client wants to sue me for defamation, they're welcome to try. But I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what I saw or change my story to make your job easier. The attorney's expression hardened further. Mr. Webb, I don't think you fully appreciate the resources at Meridian's disposal. They're a multinational corporation with extensive legal and investigative capabilities. If they determine you pose a threat to their business interests, they can make your life extremely difficult. Marcus felt the cold anger settling into his chest, the same emotion he had experienced when Meridian sent him the photograph of Emma. Is that a threat, Mr. Chen? The attorney stood abruptly, his professional composure giving way to barely controlled frustration. It's a statement of fact. You're a construction supervisor with a young daughter. You have a mortgage, work obligations, a life that requires stability and predictability. My client can disrupt all of that if you insist on supporting false accusations made by a disgruntled former employee. Marcus straightened to his full height, using the physical advantage to shift the power dynamic in the confined space. I think we're done here. You can tell your client that threats won't change what I witnessed or what I've told authorities. And you can tell them that if anything happens to my daughter, if anyone even approaches her, I will dedicate every resource and capability I possess to destroying everyone involved. The counter-threat hung in the air between them, explicit and personal in ways that violated every norm of civilized discourse. The attorney's face flushed with anger, but underneath Marcus could see something else. Uncertainty, perhaps even fear, as Chen realized he was dealing with someone who wouldn't be intimidated through conventional pressure. You're making a serious mistake, the attorney said quietly, moving toward the trailer door. Meridian protects its interests aggressively. You'd be wise to reconsider your position before circumstances force that reconsideration upon you. After the attorney departed, Marcus remained motionless for several minutes, allowing his breathing to return to normal while replaying the conversation in his mind. Agent Chen had been right about Meridian's approach. They had sent someone with legal credentials, someone who could maintain plausible deniability while delivering threats wrapped in professional language. Marcus's phone buzzed with a text from Agent Chen requesting immediate contact. He stepped outside the trailer and called the number, keeping his voice low despite the construction noise that provided natural sound masking. We got everything, Chen said without preamble. Clear audio of threats linking your cooperation with law enforcement to potential harassment of your daughter. That attorney just handed us evidence of witness intimidation that we can trace directly back to Meridian's legal team. The satisfaction in the agent's voice was evident, but Marcus felt only grim determination rather than any sense of victory. This was just the opening move in what would likely be an extended confrontation. Meridian had tested his resolve and found him unwilling to be intimidated. Their next approach would be more aggressive, less constrained by legal niceties. What happens now? Marcus asked, watching Torres direct a crew of electricians through a complex installation sequence. Now we wait for their next move while building our case, Agent Chen replied. The attorney's visit gives us probable cause to expand our investigation of Meridian's security operations. We're executing search warrants on their corporate offices this afternoon, seizing communications records and financial documents. Your contribution just accelerated our timeline significantly. Marcus ended the call and returned to work, throwing himself into the familiar routines of managing construction schedules and quality inspections. The physical demands of the job site provided temporary distraction from the anxiety that had been his constant companion since the parking garage encounter. But as afternoon stretched toward evening, Marcus found his attention repeatedly drawn to his phone, checking for updates from the agents protecting Emma. Each message confirming her safety provided momentary relief before the anxiety reasserted itself, the parental worry that no amount of professional protection could completely eliminate. Torres approached as Marcus was preparing to leave for the day, his weathered face carrying concern that went beyond workplace matters. "Webb, that suit who came by earlier. He wasn't here about construction permits or zoning issues. Want to tell me what's really going on?" Marcus considered deflecting before deciding that Torres deserved honesty. "I helped someone who was in trouble. Now the people she was running from are trying to convince me that helping her was a mistake." The foreman nodded slowly, his expression suggesting he had dealt with similar situations in his own past. "Those people going to be a problem for the crew? For the project?" Marcus shook his head firmly. "This is personal, between me and them. I won't let it affect the work or put anyone here at risk." Torres studied him for a long moment before clapping a heavy hand on Marcus's shoulder. "Brother, if you need backup, you say the word. Half this crew are veterans or guys who've been through rough patches. We take care of our own." The offer was genuine and deeply appreciated, though Marcus had no intention of dragging construction workers into a conflict with corporate security professionals. Still, knowing he had people willing to stand with him provided comfort beyond any practical tactical advantage they might offer. Marcus drove to his mother-in-law's house as the sun began setting, following the route he had traveled hundreds of times over the years since his wife's death. Patricia had been his anchor during those first impossible months, taking Emma when grief paralyzed him, providing stability when his world felt like it was disintegrating. He owed her more than he could ever repay, which made involving her in this dangerous situation feel like a betrayal of that debt. Patricia met him at the door, her expression carrying worry that she tried to hide for Emma's sake. The little girl was visible through the window, playing in the backyard with the focused intensity she brought to imaginary adventures.